Hello birdcrafters, welcome to something slightly different. I did promise you a session on ladybirds, so just for tonight, you're ladybird crafters. I hope you enjoy the session. What is a ladybird? Well, for a start, it's not a lady of any kind, nor is it a bird, but it is a beetle. And there are many different species of beetle, as you know, but they belong to a very specific group of beetles. Some of you I know are very keen on the scientific aspects of things, so here's a scientific classification of ladybirds. And if you look down to the order, you can see it says Coleoptera. Coleoptera, of course, are the beetles. And then if you go down to family, you can see the Coccinellidae, and all ladybirds fall into the family Coccinellidae. I'm not going to dwell too long on the anatomy of a ladybird. Suffice to say there are a few bits of a ladybird that you really want to be concentrating on when it comes to identifying them. First of all, you've got the wing cases, which here are referred to as elytrons. Each one is an elytron. The two together are called elytra. So if you ever hear that phrase, that's what it's referring to. They're usually quite colourful in most of the ladybirds, often spotted, but not necessarily so. So we'll more of that a bit later. But another bit that you need to be concentrating on is the area known as the pronotum. And that's almost like a head shield. And if you are careful and you are trying to identify different ladybirds, sometimes you might want to turn them over and look on the underside, because things like leg colour can vary from species to species, and some have white spots in the coxal area at the base of the legs. So it's an important part of a ladybird sometimes to help you identify it, but most of the time you can do it from the top side by just looking at the elytra. For a ladybird to reach adulthood, it goes through a series of life changes. It goes through what's called complete metamorphosis. From egg, top left hand side, it hatches out and it's what's called an instar, this tiny larvae. There are 4 instars before it reaches the point where it can change into a chrysalis on the bottom right there. And you notice on the top right there's a final instar larvae with its legs sort of bent under itself. As soon as you see that, you know it's in what's called the resting phase. What you can't see there is it's anchored the tip of its abdomen down with silk, and it will use that as an anchor point so it can shed its final skin and become a chrysalis. The chrysalis will be there for roughly a fortnight before it hatches out, and out will emerge a ladybird. In this case, it's actually a 2-spotted ladybird emerging from it, but it's bright yellow. Very odd. How confusing. The truth is that ladybirds do not have their spots when they first emerge. They only develop over the next sort of 24-48 hours or so. You'll notice also that the wings that are underneath the elytra, which we mentioned before, the wing cases, are extended just in the same way that a butterfly has to extend its wings. It pumps fluid into those wings to extend the membranes out so that it can then dry them out so they become functioning wings. And then, of course, on the bottom left-hand side, you've got a pair of ladybirds mating. Note that the one on top, which is the male, is markedly smaller than the female. And this goes for virtually all ladybirds. They vary in size. Both males and females can vary in size, but generally the male is considerably smaller than the female. Like most people, before I started researching on ladybirds, I had no real understanding of why a ladybird was called a ladybird. The truth is, I probably didn't know because I'm anything but religious. It turns out it has a religious background and it relates to the Virgin Mary. Apparently she had a veil with 7 spots on it, which represented the 7 sorrows and the 7 joys. And of course, one of our commonest ladybirds is red with 7 black spots. And so transference of one thought into another, and then presto, the ladybird gets its name. We're all familiar with ladybirds. Generally they're pretty obvious and they're not too difficult to actually see under many circumstances, but amazingly, quite frequently, when you're actually trying to find one, you can't. So you have to find different techniques to actually get to grips with them so you can actually get a decent look at the different species. So over the next little while we're going to be looking at some of the different techniques you can use, both in your gardens and further afield, to find ladybirds. Unlike with many types of invertebrate, searching by eye is actually fairly productive when it comes to ladybirds. They tend to be found in certain localities more than others. So for instance, in flowery meadows, on the tips of buds, underneath leaves of things like sycamore, or sometimes, particularly in the autumn, they'll be gathering on posts and other places within other well vegetated areas. So different parts and different places at different seasons, and some ladybirds are quite specific. So for instance, if I'm looking for kidney spot ladybird, I'll often target willows in wettish locations and looking on the bark quite low down during the winter period, looking for the shiny little black dots where the ladybirds have ensconced themselves into the recesses of the bark. So yeah, different places, different times, but searching by eye is definitely worthwhile. Without doubt, using a beating tray, or an upturned umbrella for that matter, as a collecting tool, and then tapping rather smartly but not aggressively onto branches and leaves and the like, and having the beating tray underneath, is really one of the best methods for finding ladybirds. There are many species of tree which have a great pull on ladybird species that might be feeding on the various aphids, or they might be eating the mildew on the leaves or whatever it may be, but tapping those branches dislodges them. It's no point keep wrapping the same branch, because if you don't dislodge them first time, they'll grip ever tighter. So it's usually that first tap or two that knocks them off onto the beating tray. And then you just put the tray down in a suitable locality and have a good look through. What I would advise is letting things settle for a couple of minutes before you give up on it, because ladybirds will often play doggo, go completely motionless, and cannot be easily seen always until they start to right themselves and move around on the actual surface of the beating tray. It's surprising how many times you don't see them initially. So beating trays definitely are one of the best methods for finding ladybirds. Sweeping is a traditional technique for capturing insects in grasslands and in shrubby bushy places, but it's not my favourite technique for a number of reasons. One being that you do get a high rate of attrition with the insects. You get a lot of damage to the insects by this technique, and so I tend to use it fairly minimally. Don't do it in wet conditions, you'll just magnify the damage exponentially. Only do it in dry conditions, and I tend to use a sort of figure of 8 motion. You always keep the open side moving forwards. What I will say is, if you sweep regularly and you sweep constantly day after day, doing lots of surveys, you'll almost certainly get tennis elbow. So it's another reason not to use this particular method over much, but it is very effective at finding certain types of ladybird, obviously the grassland species in particular. And I would recommend giving it a go, and you don't have to use any kind of expensive stuff. You can easily make your own sweep net, but the mesh has to be fine enough to capture the insects and not have them pass through. Don't do this at home. Isn't that what they always say? Yes, so not everybody's going to have a still blower, which is actually converted to being a sucker. And don't expect to go out and purchase one. They're several £100s, so this is just an aside. It's a suction sampler, very, very useful, particularly in shorter vegetation, which is really a bit too low for the effectiveness of sweep netting. And it's a very, very useful method for finding some of the inconspicuous ladybirds, the ones that are small little tiny dots, almost little brown ladybirds, that are often very, very close to ground level and very, very hard to sample it in any other way. So there are 47 different species of ladybird in the UK, but only 27 of them are what they call conspicuous ladybirds. They're the ones we're going to concentrate on by and large in the remainder of this particular presentation. And many of those species can and do occur in gardens, even quite small gardens, and so it's not going to be impossible for you to find half a dozen different species in your garden. The rest are called inconspicuous ladybirds. We'll have a little closer look at those briefly. Conspicuous ladybirds are, by their very nature, conspicuous. They're usually brightly coloured in one form or another, often in yellows, blacks, reds, oranges, whites, combinations of those. They're often quite shiny, they're often fairly large. When I say large, certainly 5 millimetres or above. Even the smallest ones are over 3 millimetres in length, and so they're really quite visible to the naked eye under many circumstances. The inconspicuous ladybirds, by contrast, are usually very small indeed. The largest barely gets to 3 millimetres in length, and many of them are only around about 1.2 to 1.5 millimetres in length and are genuinely midget sized, and they're usually brownish or red or whatever. The one on the right here is called Cockydoodle rufa, and you can see that tiny little ladybird a couple of millimetres off the ground is going to be hard for anybody to spot. So here we've got the little and large of the ladybird world, at least in the UK, that is. On the left we've got a tiny inconspicuous ladybird referred to as the dot ladybird, Stethurus pusillus. Pusillus basically means tiny or minute, also known as a spider mite destroyer, so it's obviously a predator on spider mites, and it's only 1.3 millimetres long, literally is a dot. On the other hand, you've got the eyed ladybird, Anatis ocellata, 8.5 millimetres in length. A big chunky beast of a thing. If you tap it out of a pine tree, because that's where you find the Scots pine in particular, then when it drops onto your beating tray, you'll think you've found the mother lode. It's a massive thing, and those eye spots are usually ringed with yellow, as you can see here. And also when you're looking at it, you'll notice it's actually bigger than a harlequin. That's probably a good thing, because it means it will eat harlequin ladybirds. Means it's probably going to be okay despite the invasion of the harlequin. So this is a question that I get asked a lot, and the general answer is no, but I'll go into more detail to make sure that the answer is actually yes as well. Now, how can that possibly be? Well, for a start, I mentioned at the beginning about the ladybirds when they first emerge from the chrysalis being a different colour. Well, they're usually pale orange or pale yellow or even bright red, and then they start to assume the melanin in their elytra and they get black and spotty, and it does change. So, but it's only a process that occurs very rapidly initially in 24-48 hours or so, and then it's a fixed thing. Except it's not, because even if you look at a 7-spot ladybird, the red colour is a much darker red at the end of winter after it's overwintered than it is when it first emerges, when it's really quite a light orange colour. So it is changing colour whilst not. Anyway, I digress, but there are some ladybirds which do change markedly, and I will discuss those in detail in a moment. Some of our ladybirds are exceptionally variable in their patterns, but most of the patterns fall within a certain framework. Probably our most varied is a thing called the 10-spot ladybird, and it's showing you the variation here. If you look at the top central one, it's almost like a pale brown with a creamy spotting, and the one to the right of it is markedly different with a black background with orangey spotting. And yet, would you believe that the one on the left is at the beginning of the winter and the one on the right is at the end of the winter? So it goes on from what I was saying before about the gradual acquiring of colour. And although it's a similar pattern, it has changed markedly over the few months, but it's an imperceptible pace from day to day. There are huge variants in some of the ladybirds, but as I say, there's usually something you can hook onto to ensure that you're identifying the species correctly. Don't get scared by this variation. It's something that's easily solvable, and I'm sure I can get most of you to be identifying a 10-spot ladybird as opposed to a 2-spot, or a harlequin as opposed to a 7-spot, without too much difficulty. There is one species of ladybird in the UK that undergoes marked change, but a very consistent change every single year. Don't forget, these ladybirds only live for 1 year, but what you're looking at here is the winter variant of the water ladybird, also known as the 19-spot ladybird. The colour of this ladybird at this season is very specific. It is cryptic. If you look at the material that it's up against, it's got a kind of straw coloured background, which is why the elytra of this ladybird has this same basic colour pattern. But those black splodges are designed to look like the sort of smut marks that develop on the leaves and on the stems of various plants as they age through the winter in the decay process. Not only that, but water ladybird also is a very flattened ladybird, so it can actually hide under the sheaths of the leaves during the winter period, so it fits nice and snugly. If it was domed, it would struggle to get under there. Once the spring has arrived and the ladybird becomes active, in the case of the water ladybird, that cryptic coloration no longer works. So the ladybird does something differently. It acquires an orangey red background colour with black spots. The black spots stay exactly the same. But now the ladybird is giving out a different message. It's giving out a warning message. It's warning its potential predators, principally birds, that it contains poisons within its system. It is aposematic coloration. It is warning coloration. And while it's active and this colour phase exists, it helps to make sure that your predators know that you are distasteful. Unless you're lucky enough to have a sizable pond in your garden with reed mace and common reed growing in it, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see the water ladybird. Most people have never seen one. Many people don't even know they exist, but they're not at all rare, and particularly in Cheshire and South Lancashire, they're everywhere because they're often around ponds, and of course we are the pond capital of the UK. So if you don't want to spend time in your garden and you get a chance to go out, do have a look around the ponds at this time of year, particularly around the flowering plants around you. You may just spot your own very first water ladybird. This is a little bit of an aside, but it's related to birdcraft because a number of years ago I happened to be waiting for the birdcrafters to arrive at Park Gate. It was September after the first of the big tides, and I just thought I'd tap some of the nearest bushes just to see if I could find some ladybirds just for part of my research project, and lo and behold, thousands of water ladybirds dropped onto my sheet. Every tap brought hundreds more, and it was quite remarkable when we calculated up the numbers. We're talking in the millions along that stretch of the coastline. So if you do want to see a water ladybird and you haven't seen one in your nearest pond, tap a bush at Park Gate in September. That's my recommendation. The conspicuous ladybirds are colourful in general. One or two are a little bit duller than the others, but in general they're using reds and blacks and yellows and all that kind of stuff. And that's the first line of defence against their potential predators, because their warning colours basically say there's something inside me, don't eat me. I mentioned this already with a water ladybird. It's largely a very effective defence because it's a collective defence strategy, and birds do learn to avoid them just simply by looking at them and seeing the warning colours. You'll have seen it yourself on other things like wasps and bees. They're given a warning that they not only do they contain poison, but that they are armed and dangerous. So, we learn, even as humans, we learn that these colours mean something, and we generally mean keep away, I'm dangerous. Ladybirds are Mullerian mimics. What is Mullerian mimicry? Well, it's where each species does have a defensive strategy. In this case, it's a poison, and they've all got the same strategy. So they're all giving out the same defensive message. And by coincidence or by evolutionary endeavour, they've evolved the same message. And that message is using bright colours to warn the birds that they are armed and dangerous. They have to give out a consistent message for it to work. So many species will have black and yellow, red and black, as we mentioned before. In this case, on the left, you've got a pine ladybird, and the one on the right is a quadrimaculata form of the two-spot ladybird. Now, a bird predator is not going to look at these two and go, that one's a pine ladybird, and that one's a two-spot. they're going to go, red and black, I'm not touching that. So basically, this collective strategy helps defend more of them from the potential predator threat. Otherwise, the birds would consistently keep trying different ones before they realised that they were, full of poisons and they wanted to leave them alone. So this is a very, very effective defence overall. In contrast, there's a thing called Batesian mimicry, which I'll just allude to for a moment. That's where there is one that has the genuine defences and the predator leaves it alone, and then there's another one that mimics the one that's got the poisons in or whatever, but it doesn't actually have them itself. And in that case, it's a fake. It's just a bluff, but it's still effective. But you can't call a bluff too often, can you? So it's best to be armed and dangerous. Because several of the species have similar colours and patterns, it can make identification a little bit more complicated, but there's usually something that you can use as an identifying factor. So in the case of the 14 spot ladybird, it's the one on the left, and the 22 spot ladybird, the one on the right. Well, you'd think it would be straightforward, just count the spots, but actually counting spots doesn't always work because there can be a variation in the number of spots. But one of the consistencies between these two species, even though they're both yellow and black, is if you look carefully at the spotting of the 22 spot ladybird, it's a rough guide, but generally the spots seem a bit circular, and certainly the yellow background is a very bright yellow. If you look at the ladybird on the left, the 14 spot, those spots are very much more rectangular or squarish in shape. They form a different pattern obviously on the elytra, but one of the things I noticed about when I look at 14 spot ladybirds, they almost look like they've got a clown face, or if you're like me, a Doctor Who fan, they look a bit like a Cyberman face. And so there's a distinct difference between 14 and 22 spot, even though they're using an effectively similar colour pattern. I'm sure most of you at some point have held a ladybird and then looked at your hand and wondered what that yellow stuff is that's on your hand, and if you're like me and a bit curious, you may have tasted it. You don't do it twice because it's foul, it's acrid, it's absolutely disgusting, and there's a reason for that, because that yellow stuff is in fact what's called reflex blood, and it contains the poisons which defend the ladybird from attack. It's like the last line of defence against the predator. And it's usually pretty effective for the types of predators it's trying to dissuade. It may not save the individual ladybird, but they will remember that and they will not try another one. So a bird can only eat 2 or 3 of these things before it makes it seriously ill, whereas I think we'd have to eat 30 or 40 before we felt a bit queasy. But hey, have a go, see what the numbers are. I'd like to know what the result is. All those bright colours may save a ladybird from the predaceous attempts of a bird, but they're no defence against the braconiid wasp called Dinocampus coccinellae. The ladybird will attempt to fend them off, but invariably the wasp pierces the underbody of the ladybird and injects an egg. That's bad enough. That egg then hatches out, and the grub that develops inside the ladybird is effectively eating all of the bits inside the ladybird that are not keeping the ladybird alive, so all the fat stores and all those sorts of things. And gradually the grub gets to the point where it needs to emerge from the ladybird. As it does so, it comes out from the underbody. It then ties the legs of the ladybird down. At this stage the ladybird is pretty much immobilised, and the braconiid wasp will actually pupate underneath the ladybird. It sequesters the ladybird's defences to help protect itself. So if a ladybird does happen to be attacked by a bird, whatever, it will exude the reflex blood and fend off the potential predator. And of course then the wasp will fly away and the whole process will start again. There are other potential predators on ladybirds. Spiders take an awful lot of them, but on the top right hand side you see a thing called the common flower bug. Now common flower bugs are tiny little things really, but you may have noticed them. They're these tiny little bugs that you can get on your skin when you're walking through woodlands and so on. Suddenly you go, what's that? And you look down, it's one of these little characters, and here's one piercing a pre-pupal harlequin ladybird larvae and basically sucking its body dry of all juices. So yeah, there's all kinds of predators out there, and at certain life stages they're more vulnerable than others, and certainly that pre-pupal stage is a very vulnerable part of the process in the ladybird life cycle. Not all birds find ladybirds distasteful. In the case of the common swift, they eat huge numbers of ladybirds, and it's probably the bright colours are no defence against this particular predator, simply because it's closing on its prey so fast it doesn't even have time to identify that it's got particular warning colours on it, and it's just grabbing it and swallowing it down. So the swift has probably had to acquire some form of immunity to the various different poisons in the ladybirds, just as its own backup against that potential threat. So yeah, bright colours aren't a defence all the time against birds. I'm pretty sure that most of you know that aphids are a favourite prey item of ladybirds. Well, that's only partly true. There are many species of ladybird that favour aphids as their prey item, but they're by no means exclusive or the only thing that they eat. And there are some ladybirds that definitely don't eat aphids, and we'll look at some of those as well. This one does, as you can see. It's the annulata form of a two-spot ladybird. This ladybird, the 24-spot ladybird, is actually a vegetarian. It actually eats things like falso grass and red campion, and its damage is very minimal. You won't necessarily see it, and you're not likely to get it in your garden because it tends to like those big floristic meadows. So unless you've got one of those, I wouldn't think about finding this in your garden. But if you do have, maybe you've got it. It tends to be coastal in this part of the world. So the Thurston grasslands along Parkgate, that's the sort of places where you will find it quite consistently. And where you find it, it can be very abundant. You can see the distribution of 24 spot here, and you notice that in the southeast it seems to be everywhere, and then as you go further north and west it gets much more coastal in its distribution, which backs up what I was saying about the grasslands of coastal areas here tend to be the best place to look for it. The tiny 16 spot ladybird is another one that doesn't eat aphids. In fact, it mostly eats things like pollen and nectar and fungi. It can be incredibly abundant where you find it in the grasslands that it favours. It tends to like dry grasslands rather than the sort of wet, spongy, clay-ridden grasslands that we are abundantly favoured with. So it's more likely to be encountered in the east of the county and the south of the county than on the west side. But hey, you might again find it coastally here, so have a look for it. Just worth noting, similar distribution to 24 spot in the way that it's very abundant inland in the southeast, and then it peters out as you get to this area. And in fact, I've only ever found it once in Cheshire. So yeah, chances of finding it are not too high. But again, if you go coastal in this area, there is a chance. Guinea spot ladybird is one that could turn up in a garden, particularly if you've got a big ash tree or big lots of willows, something like that. They tend to favour those trees. It's quite a shiny black ladybird. It's not particularly large, but it does have a pie dish edge to it. And the only two other species you could mix it up with are the very rare heather ladybird, which is only in heathland areas. And then there's the pine ladybird, which actually has 4 red spots on its elytra. So I think you might identify this species quite readily, particularly if you make a note of that pie dish edge to the size of the elytron. If you look at this distribution map for kidney spot ladybird, you get the impression that it's pretty hard to find. It's going to be pretty rare. It isn't actually that rare. It occurs all over the place, and I just think it's observer bias. So I do think if you have got an ash tree close by, have a look in the bottom sort of 2 or 3 meters of the tree trunk, particularly during the winter you might find it then, or just tap the leaves and have a go with an umbrella and a stick on the leaves of the ash or leaves of a willow or whatever, and you might be lucky, you might get a kidney spot dropping onto your beating tray. Some ladybirds are exceptionally common and others are exceptionally rare. Why are some rare and some common is a difficult question to answer, but it's definitely the case that some of them have very specific requirements. It is also the case that those requirements may change across the distribution of the ladybird. And one we're going to look at now is called the 5-spot ladybird. And where we find it in the UK are on rivers like the Spey and the Tummel and other rivers similar to that in Wales that have a lot of exposed shingle, dry river shingle, which occasionally is inundated. Those are the kinds of places you find the 5-spot ladybird, and that's the species we're going to look at now. 5-spot ladybird is a real curiosity in the UK. I mentioned those river shingles, which is the locations where we find it here. And yet if you go to Europe, it's quite widely distributed in all kinds of different habitats. One of the theories is that as a species gets closer to the edge of its distribution, its habitat requirements become ever more specific because it can only be catered for in a very small niche habitat. And that's maybe what's happening with the 5-spot ladybird. Certainly if climate change continues on the current trends, we should begin to see 5-spot ladybird broadening its horizons when it comes to its habitat distribution, certainly within the UK. And that would back up that theory. And if it doesn't happen, well, I guess there's some other factor at play, and we'll have to research that in turn. As you can see, the distribution map here clearly illustrates the lack of records from southern England, and in fact those river systems up in Scotland and Wales, that's where the consistent records are. All those other individual records you dotted around, that may not actually be 5-spot ladybirds because they're one of the most consistently misidentified species. So I'm not 100% certain that the verification process has worked in all cases. Equally, it could be. But, you know, I'm a bit of a skeptic on these things at times. Scarce 7-spot ladybird is well named. It really is scarce in the UK, but it's a very unusual ladybird. And the reason it's scarce is that it has a close association with wood ants, and wood ants aren't particularly common over much of the UK. The reason it has this association with wood ants is because it's one of the very few species of ladybird adapted to live in close harmony effectively with the wood ant. Well, when I say harmony, it's not strictly true. Basically, it's deceiving the ants. It gives off the same smell that the ants do, and so they don't identify it as a potential threat. And it is a threat because what it's actually doing is eating the aphids that the ants are farming. It's actually able to eat aphids that other ladybirds cannot, because the other ladybirds cannot withstand the defensive formic acid thrown at them by the ants, and so they get driven off. So it's a very clever strategy. The trouble is that these wood ants aren't necessarily very common throughout the UK, found on heathlands mainly in the south and southeast, and so the ladybird has a limited distribution. So these are the distribution dots for scarce 7-spot ladybird, but nearly all of those match up consistently with locations with wood ants. It isn't a species you find with any kind of regularity away from those areas, and in fact I've never yet found one in the UK. In general, we consider ladybirds to be rather friendly creatures, particularly when it comes to garden pests and the like, and we have a very benign attitude towards them, and we find them very useful. And in fact, one of them, the harlequin ladybird, which originates from Southeast Asia, was used as a biological control by farmers in various parts of the world, including in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, the harlequin didn't confine itself to the locations in which it was released, and this ladybird has the ability to breed 2 or 3 times per year, which is not the case for most ladybirds. Most of all, in fact, all of the other UK ladybirds only have 1 brood per year. So this thing outcompetes, outbreeds our native ladybirds. As a consequence, it spread very rapidly across Europe. It actually reached the UK in 2003. This sequence of maps starting in 2003 through to 2009 just shows you how rapidly the harlequin blazed a trail across the UK. It's probably the commonest ladybird in the UK now, and we are concerned that it is having a huge impact on other native species of ladybird. As you can see, the spread of this ladybird is nothing less than phenomenal. The worry is that it actually predates other ladybird species, native ladybirds, and may be having a very detrimental effect on their population levels. We can't know this for sure or in a certain way, but certainly many species of ladybird have declined in numbers, including things like two-spot ladybird. But they were declining before the arrival of the harlequin. And what is more, many species of ladybird are quite capable of predating other ladybirds. Certainly the larvae, if one larvae meets another larvae and it happens to be smaller than it, it won't phase it to eat it. In fact, it will straight away, it will see it as food. And so it's difficult to gauge the genuine impact of this species, but it's no doubt that it is having an impact. It can't not have an impact. And it's going to be interesting to see how this develops over the next few years. We may very well lose one or two of our ladybirds simply because of this invasive species. Here's a perfect illustration of what I talk about when I talk about the ladybird larvae being very predacious and cannibalistic. Here you've got a pre-pupal harlequin ladybird actually being munched, being eaten alive by another harlequin ladybird that's not quite ready to pupate. It is a case of the bite a bit. Rather like the 10-spot ladybird, the harlequin does come in a variety of colour forms. They're fairly consistent, but there's a bit of variety within those consistencies, if that's not inconsistent. Anyway, the three types for what they are is the Cecilia form, which tends to be an orangey form, quite spotty. Then there's a conspicuous form, which is basically a black form with two large red spots, often complete, and this one happens to have a little bit of black dotting in the centre. And then there's a spectabilis form, and you can see that's got 4 red dots, a bit like a two-spot ladybird. There's that Mullerian mimicry coming in again. If you look at the one at the bottom left, it looks like it's a completely different colour form, but it's actually at the extreme end of the Cecilia spotty form. And what we found is that when ladybirds are pupating in cooler conditions, they tend to lay down more black or more melanin in their system. So if it's hot, then you get the very spotty Cecilia, and if it's cold, you often get more of these blackish forms of the Cecilia type. It's just an interesting aside, but it just shows you how variable they can be within a form. This is probably the commonest question I get asked. Why do ladybirds congregate in my house? There's a simple reason for that. They are looking for safe hibernation sites during the winter period, and they tend to come indoors around about October-ish. And they're looking for somewhere that's going to be dry, consistent temperature, not going to dehydrate them. They do often get it wrong because when you go to houses, you've got now lots of modern central heating, and they overheat, and then they get active, and then they get dehydrated, and then they die. But where they can successfully hibernate within houses, they seem to come back to the same place each year. And householders wonder why that happens. And that's because they actually leave behind a trace. It's different ladybirds coming back, not the same ladybirds, it's different generation. But the new ladybirds coming in each autumn sniff out that location, and they can smell the trace, and they go to where that trace is, and they gather in exactly the same spots year on year. You'll often find that there are several species associated with these particular congregations, but these days it's the harlequin that is forming these big aggregations within houses, and mostly it's just a single species involved, even though, as on this one photograph here, it looks like half a dozen different species may be involved. They're all harlequins. Some of you, not all of you, but some of you, are old enough to remember 1976. It was a long, hot summer. And some of you will remember it was famous for the ladybird plagues. And you may be asking what caused them. Well, the answer was actually quite straightforward. The long, hot summer of 1976 created an absolute boom in aphids. In response, the ladybirds breeding that year produced a bumper generation. Masses and masses of 7-spot ladybird and 11-spot ladybird and 2-spot ladybird just boomed in numbers. The problem was the drought continued, and when the drought continued, the aphids ran out of food, and then they crashed in numbers. And then the ladybirds that were predating the aphids had a problem. They had no food left. They had to move to find food, and they came across huge swathes of the UK and got piled up, particularly in coastal areas, as you see in this photograph here. The ladybirds were starving. There were reports of ladybirds biting people, not something you hear of consistently, but they were really desperate and they were trying anything and everything, and basically they also crashed in numbers. They died out in the millions and billions probably. And these things happen periodically, and the last big year was 2009. I began recording ladybirds back in 2009. I didn't know it at the time, but it was another bumper year. I happened to go to a strip of what looked like initially hay meadow, but was in fact a cornfield annual meadow in the central reservation of the A562 between Widnes and Warrington. It was about 100 and odd metres in length. It was only about 10 or 12 metres wide. When I got to the meadow and looked in it, I found a 7-spot ladybird, and then I found another, and then I found another, and I found another. And it soon became apparent there were just masses of them. And then I thought I'd do something interesting. I thought I'd count them, not individually of course, I did it scientifically. So what I did, I measured a square metre and I counted how many ladybirds were in a square metre. And I did that several times in several different localities. And I came up with an average figure, a number, for how many were per metre. And then when I totalled up the number of square metres within that strip of cornfield annual meadow, it turned out there were 19,000 7-spot ladybirds. That's a pretty astonishing number. And it just shows you the potential that they have when the conditions are right to really boom in numbers. It's not happened since then. I've never seen anything like that. But there's going to be another time, and it could be this year because it's such a fantastic spring. I think the ladybirds could be having a fantastic breeding season, and if the weather stays right for them, we could have another 1976 on our hands. 2-spot ladybird is probably one of the easiest ladybirds to identify. It's red with 2 black spots on the elytra. Dead easy, except of course it's not, because then there is a whole bunch of black colour forms with a variable number of spots. There's sex postulata with 6 red spots, 2 big ones at the front, 2 red ones in the middle, and then 2 tiny dot red spots right at the back end. There's quadrimaculata. That's a bit easier. 2 big red ones at the front, 2 red ones in the middle. Job's a good one. And then there are all sorts of weirdy colour forms. And there's one called annulata, which has got these kind of large splodgy spots, sometimes in the middle, sometimes variable, sometimes consistent. It's all over the place. So your ability to identify this ladybird might rely on other factors like turning it over and seeing it's got black legs as opposed to red legs. There's a number of things that you can do to help you identify a ladybird. And looking at the shape of it, looking at the colour of the legs, looking at the shape of the pronotum, looking at the colours in terms of the base colours and the patterns, they'll all help. But do you remember what we do with birds, birdcraft? I talk about the character of the bird. Ladybirds do have a character, and the different species are slightly different too in the shape and the form of them. So never forget that. Don't just look at the colours and the spots, look at the shape and the form of the ladybird. We mentioned 10-spot ladybird before and how variable it was. There's 3 basic colour forms. There's Decim punctata, which is the spotty one on the left with what looks like a dog's paw print on its pronotum. In the middle you've got another colour form which looks like a checkerboard really, but it's called Decempustulata, and that can vary quite a lot from that sort of brownish colour to this really very black form. And then on the right hand side we've got Bimaculata, which looks a bit like the pine ladybird or two-spot ladybird in the black colour forms. So very variable, but when you turn it over it has red legs, not black. So if you get mixed up between that and a two-spot, turn it over and have a look at the leg colour. 14-spot ladybird is actually one of our commonest ladybirds. It's very frequently found in gardens, but it's a late rising ladybird. It doesn't get up from hibernation until certainly early April, maybe a bit later than that. One of the easiest ways I've found to come across it is to target things like flowering hawthorn. So if you've got some of that in your garden, tap that when it's in full flower and you've got a high chance of getting one of these ladybirds, which are aphidectors, so they're actually after aphids, and obviously after prey going towards the floristic content of the bushes and trees and things. But otherwise you can find it in grasslands, you can find it on trees, so different methods will find it. When you see it, don't forget those squarish looking spots to help you identify it. 22 spot is a mildew feeding ladybird, and it particularly favours things like hogweeds. You will find it on oak quite late in the season, when you get that sort of powdery mildew effect going on the leaves of oak. But generally it's a ground dwelling species. Sweeping is normally the best method to find it. It's quite a domed ladybird, and those spots, don't forget, rather circular on a bright yellow background. So this is cream spot ladybird. Sometimes get attracted to moth lights and things like that. It's actually quite easy to identify. It's got a maroon sort of base colour with clearly whitey cream spotting on it. And one of the things that is weird about this ladybird is that when it lays its eggs, it coats them with a kind of red solution, a red jelly. Now here's a strange thing: the harlequin ladybird, which eats all kinds of other ladybirds' eggs, does not eat the cream spot eggs. They must really taste awful. So whatever it is that's laid over those eggs, it's acting as an effective defence against the harlequin, which probably explains why it's doing quite well. And if you tap all kinds of trees and shrubs and bushes, there's a high chance you could get a cream spot ladybird dropping off them. Look at the head shield, it's solid, there's no clear slots through it at all, which helps you to separate it out from the next species, the orange ladybird. So the orange ladybird, this has a fascinating history within the UK. Just for a moment I'm going to focus on how to identify it. If you look at the pronotum, look at that clear perspex edge through which it can actually peep at you as it protects its vulnerable parts. It's also much brighter, paler orange colour than you'll find with the brownish maroon colour, base colour of the cream spot. And the edge of it is different on the elytra as well. Look at that sort of curved out edge to the elytra. Very distinct and very different. It's quite a big ladybird, and it feeds mainly on things like mildews. In trees particularly it favours sycamore. I find it on field maple and one or two others, but it loves sycamore. Now here's the thing, a couple of centuries ago it was barely known in the UK, and only about a century ago it was still regarded as a very, very rare species, only in places like ancient woodland sites in southern England. That's how it remained pretty much until fairly recent times. And then a little girl was tapping a sycamore and found an orange ladybird. Nobody bothered really tapping sycamores because of course they don't hold much in the way of insects, which of course is a whole load of nonsense. But this is how things go, people get told a story and believe it. So this little girl taps this tree and she finds an orange ladybird. Nobody will believe her until it's identified properly by an expert. Lo and behold, without us realising it, orange ladybirds have adapted from these ancient oak woodland sites to feeding on sycamore, and they do it consistently all across the UK. And now all you need to do to find an orange ladybird is go and tap a sycamore. Certainly by sort of July, August, there'll be tons of them on there. And so I would recommend you do that. If you've got a sycamore in your garden, you could even find it now. So have a look at that. In the wintertime, tap hollies and other evergreen shrubs, and you could easily find an orange ladybird by doing that. Or if you run a moth trap, you may very well find orange ladybirds attracted to that as well. So it's not at all rare in the UK now anyway. So I've been running identification courses for ladybirds for quite some time. If you look very carefully at the centre of this picture, there is a young boy. You might recognise who it is. It's Ben Miles. And we're at Liverpool Museum, and I'm running a course about identifying these different ladybirds. And Ben and Chris leave the course at the end of it, walk out into Stanley Gardens, and they find some orange ladybirds clustered on the walls of Stanley Gardens. The thing is, they didn't just find a handful of orange ladybirds, they actually found something like 500 of them clustered on the walls below the plane trees in Stanley Gardens. It turned out to be the largest ever concentration of orange ladybirds found anywhere in the UK. It was such an event that they ended up on television. Ben ended up being interviewed by Diane Oxbury, and it was on North West Tonight. So pretty amazing to come out of an identification course and actually make history in one form or another. But that's what Ben did on his very first effort. Some of the ladybirds in your garden are familiar to you, things like the 7-spot and possibly the 2-spot and maybe the harlequin. But there's something that you may be not familiar with really, and one is the pine ladybird. If you have a Scots pine in your garden or a black pine or one just in the neighbourhood, give it a tap. You've got a very high chance of dislodging a pine ladybird. The way to identify it is to look at those red spots on the black elytra. The forward spots are in a kind of hook shape, and when you look at the ladybird consistently, it looks like a pair of horns when you look at it from the top. And if I show this to any child and say, what does this look like? Almost invariably they say to me, it's got devil's horns. I don't know why I say it in that accent, but it just comes out. And anyway, by the by, look at the devil's horns at the front end, and that will help you to identify it, along with that slight piedish edge, because it's quite closely related to the kidney spot ladybird that you saw earlier. The cream-streaked ladybird is actually quite closely related to the harlequin. Most people don't even know it exists. You find it on pine trees, particularly on Scots pine, but even more so on black pine. And in fact, if you tap just about any black pine, if you've got it in your garden or in a neighbourhood, you'll almost certainly get this species dropping onto your beating tray. It comes in a couple of different colour forms. One is quite spotty, and the other one has sort of blank spots in the middle like this one does. This is known as the 4-spotted form. But they both consistently have that kind of dog paw print, black and white pattern on the pronotum. It's quite a flattened ladybird compared to harlequin or even 7-spot ladybird, and mostly it has quite a clear and obvious creamy streaked edge to the elytra. It has reddish legs as well. It's quite a large ladybird, not quite as big as a harlequin, but almost as big. And it's certainly not infrequent or uncommon in our part of the world. You have a high chance of finding this ladybird if you tap a pine tree. So give it a go, and you may find your very first cream-streaked ladybird. The final ladybird for our session is going to be 11-spot ladybird. It's not particularly common, but it does occur in gardens. You've got a higher chance of finding it if you're nearer to the coast. It's another one of those things where the further north you go, the more coastal it becomes. You can see that the one on the right actually has a yellow sort of ring pattern around its black spots. That's fairly common, but it's a species that you find by beating low bushes and shrubs and hedges, and I found it in my garden. You could easily find it in yours. In the summer of '76 it was very common. It's not been particularly common since then, but hey, we're having another bumper spring, and maybe this is a species that will turn up in your garden over the next few days and weeks. And certainly if you tap pine trees in the winter, you've got a good chance of finding it. So on that note, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and I shall see you maybe in a month's time, maybe in 2 months' time, and by then you'll be experts on ladybirds. Take care, have fun, bye bye.